Corinthians 9, in the second half of 1 Corinthians 9, we see Paul's missionary aim in setting aside his liberties for the sake of the gospel. Here's what we read in verse 19. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. Paul is doing everything he can do to win more. Now, this doesn't mean that Paul is some kind of, ascetic monk who believes that the more pain and discomfort he feels, somehow the holier he is. Paul will use and utilize his freedom and his rights as long as they do not present obstacles to the gospel. One example of that is Paul's right as a Roman citizen. In Acts 16:37 and 22, verses 25 through 29, Paul will use his rights as a Roman citizen to protect his own life or to correct injustices. And so it doesn't prevent, those rights do not present a stumbling block to the gospel, and so Paul enjoys them and participates in them. So our call here isn't just towards Christians making their life as uncomfortable as possible just for the sake of it, but rather our aim is that we're always looking to what will create obstacles and opportunities to the gospel. And whenever one of our rights that are down the category, just down on here, are decide matters, that are matters of Christian liberty and conscience, when those present obstacles to the gospel, then we either choose not to voice our opinion on those things, or we deprive ourselves of those liberties for the sake of our weaker brothers, and for the sake, here in 1 Corinthians 9, of those outside of the gospel. So this means that the Christian disciple will at times, for the sake of the gospel, abstain from freedoms that they have an opportunity to enjoy, or participate in things that they wouldn't normally participate in for the sake of the gospel. So Paul tells us that to the Jews, he becomes like a Jew. To the Greeks, he becomes like a Greek. To those who have a weak conscience, he becomes like a weak one. He does all of this, we read, that by all means I might save some. So remember, Paul is not going to, he's not cutting things out of the gospel. And in fact, when we read verses 20 through 22, Paul will say, to the Jews I've become as a Jew, and to those under the law I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside of the law. So I think Paul's making those qualifying statements to show that he's not fundamentally changing and shaping the message that he believes in the Bible, but rather he's going to contextually lean one way or another in the customs he follows, the words he uses, the actions he participates in. He will participate in things as his conscience allows him that do not violate Scripture, but he may just not personally participate in were he left to himself. But rather his missionary zeal, his desire to see more people come to Christ is going to cause him to lean certain ways, which will curtail maybe his own preferences, and then just lead him to do things that maybe he wouldn't normally do on his own. So this is instructive for us, friends, as we think about our missionary endeavors and our desire to engage those around us with the gospel. We know that we will have differences of opinions with non-Christians, both over matters that are directly related to the gospel and over matters that aren't directly related to the gospel, but are just preferences that we have. So let's think hypothetically. Let's say you have 3 neighbors. One of your neighbors is a Mormon, one of your neighbors is an LGBT activist, and another neighbor is a nominal Christian who grew up in the church but has since drifted away. Now, you have views about the gospel that will offend all three of those individuals. And there's nothing you can do about that. You cannot change the message of the gospel. But you likely also have other views that are not directly connected to the gospel that offend all three of those people. So imagine that you have a barbecue, and at your barbecue, you're sitting there having conversations with these three neighbors. And you come to realize that your Mormon neighbor who has come over is very offended that you have a cooler full of beer there and you're drinking a beer. And that, from his very, very traditional conservative values, he believes to be wrong. And so he now is viewing you askance and more skeptical. And let's say the LGBT activist neighbor who you're having over for a barbecue is offended by the fact that you have a sign posted in your front yard that is advertising a conservative politician that they find to be morally reprehensible. And so now they're viewing what you have to say about other things with a sense of skepticism. And let's say that the nominal Christian who's coming over just entered into a heated debate with you over which of the Star Wars trilogies was best, and you passionately argued. And now he feels frustrated because he thinks that you think his taste in movies is stupid. And now he feels frustrated with you. Now, obviously, some of those disagreements are more important than others. But friends, here's what I want you to consider. If you were this person in this hypothetical scenario, in each of those disagreements that you had, was the benefit that you got from sticking to your guns worth the consequence? Now you can decide, this is an issue where you will, according to the three dimensions of wisdom, you will have to decide whether or not you thought something was worth it, whether you thought it was worth keeping that sign in your front yard, or having that beer in your hand, or arguing for your favorite movie. But we should be slow and very careful before we present something that is an obstacle to the gospel. How you determine whether or not something is important enough to stick to requires wisdom. Wisdom and love, friends. But let's think carefully about this. Let's ask ourselves the question. Let's not just simply trumpet every opinion, every freedom we have without any consideration for how it might affect other individuals around us' ability to hear the most important thing we have to say, the gospel. The gospel is offensive in of itself. We do not need to make it any harder for people to hear that. But rather, like Paul, we should strive to become all things to all people, even if it means staying quiet sometimes, or doing something that is out of our comfort zone. We can, for the sake of the gospel and the hope of seeing our lost neighbors come to know Christ.